Poor mountain man and his dog bought an abandoned wagon. Their new life shocked everyone. Dust whirls through the mining town as a ragged man and his scarred hound step forward. With only one silver coin, he buys the wagon everyone mocks as worthless junk. The crowd laughs, but inside its broken boards lies something no one expected: a family's lost Bible, a deed to hidden land, and letters tied to a promise the railroad would rather bury. Soon, whispers spread. A widow offers him kindness, a preacher offers him shelter, and a Ute scout brings truth about a treaty the powerful want forgotten. But when the railroad strikes back with fire and fists, man and dog are left bleeding in the dust. From shame to hope, from ashes to justice, the wagon becomes more than wood, and Wheels It becomes the heart of a fight that could change a whole town. What happens when a poor man's foolish purchase becomes the one thing that could bring down the railroad's lies and give him the family he thought he lost forever? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you. Make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Silver Bluff's dusty Main Street as Kenneth Boone trudged into town, his faithful hound Ashes padding quietly beside him. Weeks of trapping in the high country had left both man and dog lean and weary. Kenneth's buckskin jacket hung loose on his frame, patches worn through at the elbows, and his boots were nearly walked through at the soles, and cooking suppers drifted from nearby chimneys, making his empty stomach growl. $1 silver weighed heavy in his pocket, all he had to show for months of hard work after trading his furs at the general store. Kenneth touched the coin through the fabric, feeling its smooth edges as he passed the sheriff's office. A small crowd had gathered in the yard beside the jailhouse, their voices carrying on the evening breeze. Curious, Kenneth paused at the edge of the gathering. Sheriff Mills stood on a wooden crate, gesturing at several wagons lined up against the fence. "Next up for auction, we've got these here freight wagons," the sheriff announced, adjusting his vest, left behind when their owners couldn't make a go of it out here. "Starting bid is $5 for any wagon you choose." Kenneth's gaze swept over the collection. Most were sturdy Conestogas, with solid wheels and good canvas tops, drawing eager attention from the assembled townsfolk. But off to the side, partially hidden in shadows, sat a smaller wagon, its wheels listed at odd angles, the wooden spokes cracked and bent. The canvas cover was torn and gray with age, flapping sadly in the wind. Something about that forgotten wagon tugged at Kenneth's heart. He knew what it felt like to be overlooked, cast aside. Without fully meaning to, he found himself stepping forward through the crowd. "I'll give you $1 for that broken one there," he said, voice rough from disuse. Laughter rippled through the gathering. Someone in back called out, "Looks like poor Kenneth's found himself a match. Broken down wreck buying broken down wreck." More chuckles followed. Kenneth felt heat rise in his cheeks, but he kept his eyes steady on the sheriff. Ashes pressed. Closer to his leg, a low growl rumbling in the dog's chest. Sheriff Mills scratched his chin, looking between Kenneth and the dilapidated wagon. "Well now, that one ain't worth much more than firewood, I reckon." He shrugged. $1 better than nothing. It's yours if you want it, Boone." Kenneth pulled the silver dollar from his pocket, the metal catching the last rays of sunlight. As he handed it over, more snickers and headshaking followed him as he made his way to his purchase. Up close, the wagon looked even worse. The axles were rusty, the trace chains missing several links. "Fool's errand," muttered one of the townsmen as the crowd began dispersing. "Man could have at least bought himself a decent meal instead." Kenneth said nothing, just began slowly leading the creaking wagon toward the edge of town. Each turn of the twisted wheels sent shudders through the frame. Ashes trotted alongside. Occasionally glancing up at his master with concerned eyes, they made camp that night in a small hollow just beyond the town limits, where the main road began its winding path into the foothills. Kenneth gathered some dry branches and soon had a small fire crackling. He sat with his back against one of the wagon wheels, ashes curled at his feet. The sounds of Silver Bluff carried faintly on the night air, piano music from the saloon, distant laughter, the occasional whinny of a horse. Kenneth could feel the townspeople's judgment even at this distance. They thought him simple, a fool who'd wasted his last dollar on worthless junk. But as he studied the wagon in the firelight, Kenneth felt something else growing beneath the shame, a quiet spark of possibility. The The damage wasn't as bad as it looked at first glance. The basic frame was solid oak, still strong despite its neglect. With some work, some patience, Ashes raised his head suddenly, ears pricking forward. Voices drifted from the road. Townsfolk heading home after the auction. "Did you see that? Sorry sight?" one man said. "Kenneth Boone spending his last coin on that wreck. Man's not right in the head, living up in them mountains too long. Probably sleep right there beside it," another replied with a laugh. "Him and that mangy hound of his." Kenneth stayed very still until their voices faded. Ashes growled softly, but Kenneth quieted him with a gentle hand on his scarred head. Let them talk. Let them laugh. He knew something they didn't. Sometimes, the things people cast aside just needed a second chance, needed someone to see their worth. He leaned his head back against the wagon wheel and looked up at the stars emerging in the darkening sky. His stomach was empty, but for the first time in a long while, his heart felt full of purpose. Tomorrow would bring what it brought. For tonight, he had a wagon, he had Ashes, and he had hope. Sometimes that was enough to start with. Dawn painted the eastern sky in soft rose and gold as Kenneth stirred from his restless sleep. Ashes was already awake, pacing around the wagon with unusual interest. Kenneth stretched his stiff muscles, his breath visible in the crisp morning air. "What's got you so worked up, boy?" he asked. Watching the hound circle the wagon for the third time, the morning light revealed details he'd missed in yesterday's dusk. The wagon's frame, though weathered, was indeed solid oak. The broken wheels would need work, but the hubcaps were sound. Even the torn canvas could be patched with the right materials. Ashes stopped near the rear of the wagon, scratching intently at the floorboards and letting out a high-pitched whine. Kenneth frowned. He'd seen his dog track rabbits and mountain cats, but this behavior was different. "Move aside, boy." Kenneth knelt to examine the spot. The wooden planks looked ordinary enough, but when he ran his fingers along the edges, he felt subtle gaps that shouldn't be there. Taking out his hunting knife, he worked the blade into one of the seams. The board lifted with surprising ease, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Kenneth's heart quickened as he pried up the surrounding planks. There, tucked away in the shadows, sat a brass-bound trunk no bigger than a wash basin. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted it out. The brass fittings were dulled with age, but still held firm. The lock had long since rusted through, falling away at his touch. Inside, the trunk's contents told a story that made Kenneth's throat tight. Women's dresses carefully folded, their fabric faded but fine, the kind worn for Sunday services or special occasions. Beneath them lay a small wooden horse, its paint chipped but still bright in places. A child's beloved toy, left behind. At the bottom rested a Bible, its leather cover smooth from years of handling. Kenneth opened it with reverent care. Between the well-worn pages, he found a folded document. His eyes widened as he read the carefully penned words, "A deed to farmland, 40 acres east of Silver Bluff." "Lord above," he whispered. This wagon wasn't just abandoned freight. It had belonged to a family, people with dreams of a new life. People who, for some reason, never came back to claim what was theirs. Ashes nosed at the trunk, sniffing the dresses before looking up at Kenneth with knowing eyes. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the air. But Kenneth felt a chill. Yesterday's purchase wasn't the worthless wreck everyone thought. It was something else entirely, a mystery, maybe even a responsibility. The sound of approaching footsteps made Kenneth look up. Reverend Carlin, the circuit preacher, stood at the edge of their camp, his black coat dusty from the road. "Morning, Kenneth," the preacher said kindly. "Saw you out here from the church window. Thought you might want to know there's space behind the chapel where you could park that wagon while you work on it, better than leaving it exposed out here. Kenneth hesitated, studying the older man's weathered face. The Reverend had always treated him fairly, even when others in town turned away. "Much obliged," Kenneth said finally. "I'd appreciate that. Bring it round whenever you're ready, Reverend," Carlin replied, tipping his hat before heading back toward town. Kenneth spent the next hour carefully repacking the trunk and replacing the floorboards. By midday, he had managed to coax the creaking wagon behind the small white church, where a stand of cottonwoods offered welcome shade. The afternoon sun was slanting westward, when new footsteps crunched on the gravel path. A woman approached, carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle. Kenneth recognized Hazel McAllister, the widow who lived in a neat cabin at the edge of town. "Thought you might be hungry," she said, without preamble, holding out the bundle. The cloth fell away to reveal a still warm loaf of bread, its crust golden brown. "Can't have you living on air and pride out here." "Ma'am, I couldn't," Kenneth started to protest. "Of course you can," Hazel cut him off, her tone gentle but firm. "And it's Hazel, not ma'am. When's the last time you ate a proper meal?" Kenneth Boone. He couldn't rightly remember, and his silence made her shake her head. "That's what I thought. Next time, don't wait until you're down to your last dollar before coming into town." She set the bread on the wagon's seat, then reached down to scratch Ashes behind the ears. The dog, usually wary of strangers, leaned into her touch. Kenneth stood awkwardly, unused to such direct kindness. "Thank you, Hazel." She nodded, satisfied, and turned to go. "You're welcome, and Kenneth, whatever you're planning to do with this wagon, don't let the town's talk stop you." He watched her walk away, the scent of fresh bread making his stomach rumble. Ashes looked up at him expectantly, tail wagging. For the first time since discovering the trunk, Kenneth felt the spark of hope grow stronger. The wagon had brought him more than just mystery. It had brought him human kindness, something he'd almost forgotten existed. Word traveled fast in Silver Bluff. By the next morning, folks passing the church lot would slow their wagons, craning their necks to watch Kenneth work. Some, like old Mrs. Peterson from the general store, stopped to offer encouragement. "Good to see someone breathing life back into that old wagon," she said, setting down a small sack of coffee beans. "My Henry always said, 'Waste not, want not.'" Others weren't so kind. Tom Fletcher, who owned the lumber mill, spat in the dust as he walked by. "Ain't worth the effort." "Boone," he called out, "that deed you found, railroad's been buying up everything east of town. They don't take kindly to folks standing in their way." Kenneth kept his head down, focusing on the broken wheel before him. Ashes limped around the wagon, his nose working. Over time, as he investigated every corner and crevice, the dog's injured leg was healing slowly, much like Kenneth's own wounded spirit. Hazel visited each day, sometimes bringing food, other times just sitting nearby, mending clothes, while Kenneth worked with tools borrowed from Reverend Carlin. "You've got steady hands," she observed one afternoon, watching him replace a cracked spoke. Most men would have given up by now. Kenneth paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "Reckon most folks think I'm fool enough to try." "Sometimes God hides blessings in broken things," Hazel said softly. "Just takes the right person to see them." Her words stayed with him, warming his heart, like the evening fire he built outside the church lot. One night, Hazel joined him there, the flames casting flickering shadows across their faces. Ashes lay between them, head resting on his paws. "My Thomas took sick 3 winters ago," Hazel shared, her voice quiet but steady. "Fever came on fast. By the time the doctor arrived from Carson City, nothing could be done." She poked at the fire with a stick. "Left me with 20 acres and more loneliness than I knew what to do with." Kenneth nodded, understanding all too well. "The mountains can be mighty quiet," he said. "Sometimes I'd go weeks without speaking to anyone but Ashes." "Why did you stay up there so long?" He stared into the flames, choosing his words carefully. "After my Sarah and the baby seemed easier than facing people, their pity, their questions." Hazel's hand found his in the darkness, squeezing gently. Neither spoke for a long while, but the silence felt comfortable, like a well-worn blanket. Looking at her profile in the firelight, Kenneth felt something stir in his chest, a cautious hope he hadn't dared entertain in years. The wagon was coming along well. With the deed he'd found, maybe he could start fresh, build something worthwhile. Maybe he didn't have to face it alone, but fate had other plans the next morning. The next morning, the quiet of Silver Bluff was broken by the clatter of an incoming stagecoach. It wasn't the regular mail run. This coach was private, painted a gleaming black with gold trim. It pulled up outside the Silver Nugget Hotel. In a cloud of dust, Kenneth was working on the wagon's canvas when a man stepped down from the coach. He wore a fine suit that hadn't seen trail dust before today, and a hat that cost more than most miners made in a month. His smile was practiced and sharp as he surveyed the town. Mr. Blackwood, Mayor Jenkins, hurried forward to greet him. "Welcome to Silver Bluff? Charming little settlement you have here," Blackwood replied, though his tone suggested he found it anything but. His eyes roamed the streets, calculating. "The Rocky Mountain Railroad Company has great plans for this valley." Kenneth felt the man's gaze sweep past the church lot, lingering on the wagon. Something in that look made his skin crawl. Ashes must have felt it too. The dog's hackles rose, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. "Hush now," Kenneth murmured, but he shared the dog's unease. He'd seen men like Blackwood before, during his trading days. They came with papers and promises, leaving broken dreams in their wake. Hazel appeared beside him, her face tight with worry. "Railroad men," she said quietly. "They've been buying up land all through the territory. Those who won't sell find themselves with mysterious accidents. Burnt barns, poisoned wells." Kenneth watched Blackwood disappear into the hotel, the mayor trailing behind like an eager pup. The hope he'd felt around the fire last night seemed to dim, but he straightened his shoulders. He'd survived mountain winters and loneliness. He wasn't about to let some railroad man chase him away from a chance at a new life. He turned back to the wagon, gripping his tools with renewed purpose. Beside him, Hazel touched his arm lightly, before returning to her mending, her presence as steady as the mountains themselves. Dawn painted the mountains in soft rose when Kenneth stirred from his sleep beneath the wagon's canvas. Ashes raised his head, ears perking at the sound of boots on wooden planks. Through the morning mist, Kenneth spotted Blackwood's dark suit as the railroad man strode purposefully toward the sheriff's office, rolled maps tucked under his arm like weapons. The sight turned Kenneth's stomach sour. He'd hoped yesterday's arrival was just passing business, but those maps spoke of different intentions. Standing slowly, he stretched his stiff muscles and pulled on his worn jacket. The morning air held an autumn bite that warned of winters. Approachy hadn't finished his morning coffee when Blackwood's shadow fell across the wagon. The railroad man stood with feet planted wide, thumbs hooked in his vest pockets, looking down his nose at Kenneth's work. "So this is the vagrant causing such a stir," Blackwood said, his voice smooth as creek stones. "I hear you found yourself a deed." Kenneth straightened, conscious of his patched clothes and untrimmed beard. "Found it fair and square in this wagon I bought at auction." "Did you now?" Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. He pulled a crisp sheet of paper from his coat, curious, since the Rocky Mountain Railroad Company has already surveyed and claimed all available land east of Silver Bluff. Progress, you see, can't have beggars and mountain men standing in the way of civilization. Heat rose in Kenneth's chest. His hands curled into fists at his sides, calloused fingers tightening until his knuckles went white. Ashes growled low, sensing his master's tension. "Kenneth!" Hazel's voice came soft but firm behind him. He hadn't heard her approach, but her hand on his arm steadied him like an anchor in rough waters. "Don't let him bait you." Blackwood's gaze flicked between them, his smile turning cruel. "Listen to your woman, mountain man. Save yourself some trouble. That deed you found not worth the paper it's written on." He turned on his heel, calling over his shoulder, "Progress doesn't wait for sentimentality." Kenneth stood rigid until Blackwood disappeared around the corner. Only then did he let out the breath he'd been holding, his shoulders sagging. "That man's got poison in his soul," Hazel said quietly, her hand still resting on Kenneth's arm. "But don't let him see he's gotten to you. That's what he wants. That's what he wants." Kenneth nodded, though the railroad man's words had shaken him more than he cared to admit. That evening, after the sun had dipped behind the peaks, he sat in the wagon's bed with a borrowed lamp, studying the deed he'd found. The paper was yellowed at the edges, but the ink remained clear enough to read. He traced the careful script with weathered fingers, feeling the slight impressions in the paper where someone had pressed hard while writing. "You'll strain your eyes in this light," Hazel called from below. The smell of rich stew drifted up, making his empty stomach growl. "Come down and eat proper food for once." "Much obliged, but I wasn't asking." Kenneth Boone, her tone brooked no argument. "A man can't think straight on an empty belly." The warmth of her kitchen felt like stepping into another world. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, and a pot of stew bubbled on the wood stove. Ashes settled by the hearth, as if he'd always belonged there, watching hopefully as Hazel filled 2 bowls. "The deed's proper," Kenneth said, between spoonfuls of the best meal he'd had in months. Signed and witnessed, but Blackwood's got papers of his own, and the railroad's got money and men behind them. Hazel set down her spoon, fixing him with a steady look. You planning to give up then? No, ma'am. The answer came quick and sure, surprising even himself. Reckon I've run from enough in my life. She nodded, satisfied. Good, because that wagon brought you here for a reason, Kenneth, and I don't believe it was just to hand everything over to the likes of Blackwood. Outside, they could hear voices from the saloon carrying on the evening air. Talk about the railroad man, about Kenneth and his broken-down wagon, about sides being chosen. The whispers that had started as mockery now held darker edges. Like storm clouds gathering before rain, Kenneth knew he'd stumbled into something bigger than a simple wagon auction. The deed in his pocket, Blackwood's threats, Hazel's quiet support, it all twisted together like a rope pulling him toward something he couldn't yet see. But for the first time in years, he felt the stirring of purpose in his chest, stronger than fear or doubt. He helped Hazel clean the dishes, their movements, falling into an easy rhythm as if they'd done this 100 times before. Outside, Blackwood and his maps might be plotting their next move. But here, in this warm kitchen, Kenneth found a moment's peace and perhaps the strength for whatever battle lay ahead. The morning sun warmed Kenneth's back as he knelt beside the wagon, driving nails into fresh boards borrowed from Reverend Carlin. The sharp rap of his hammer echoed across the churchyard, keeping time with the distant clang of the blacksmith's anvil. Every strike made the wagon a bit sturdier, a bit more like the home it must have been for its previous owners. Careful with those nails, Reverend Carlin called from his garden. They're getting scarce since the mine started buying up the hardware. Store stock. Kenneth nodded, setting each nail with extra care. The preacher had been more than generous, sharing not just tools, but encouragement when others turned away. The wagon's weathered boards were giving way to fresh pine. The wheel spokes now true and strong. Ashes had been circling the wagon all morning, his nose working overtime, snuffling at every corner. The old hound's behavior had grown more agitated. As Kenneth worked, whining and pawing at the ground beneath the back corner, "What's got into you, boy?" Kenneth wiped sweat from his brow, watching as Ashes dug with growing determination. Dirt flying between his paws, the dog's claws scraped against something solid. Kenneth set down his hammer and knelt beside the hole, brushing away loose soil to reveal a small wooden door set into the wagon's undercarriage. It had been carefully concealed, the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of secrets worth keeping. His fingers found the edge of the hidden panel. It came loose with a soft groan, revealing a space just large enough to hold a packet of letters bound with faded twine. The paper was yellow with age but had stayed dry in its hiding place. Kenneth Hazel's voice carried across the yard. She approached with a basket over her arm, likely bearing another of her attempts to keep him properly fed. "What have you found?" He held up the packet. Ashes found another hiding spot, more papers. Hazel settled beside him on an upturned crate, smoothing her skirts. "Well, don't keep me waiting. What do they say?" Kenneth untied the twine with careful fingers and unfolded the first letter. The handwriting was neat, official-looking, his throat, and began to read aloud. "Dear Mr. Harrison, I write to confirm our discussion regarding water rights along Silver Creek as representative of the Army's interests in this territory. I assure you that the terms agreed upon with White Elk's band of Ute people shall be honored in full." The letters continued, dated over several months, detailing agreements between the Army officer, the wagon's former owner, Harrison, and the local Ute band. They spoke of shared access to Silver Creek, of promises made and witnessed, of a treaty meant to protect both settlers and native rights to the water. "Lord above," Hazel breathed. "This isn't just about the railroad wanting land anymore." Kenneth's throat felt tight. "No, ma'am, it sure isn't. These letters, they prove there were promises made, sacred ones by the sound of it." "The railroad won't care about old promises," Hazel said, her voice hard, "but others will. You can't just hand these over to Blackwood. Kenneth, there's truth here that needs telling." He carefully retied the packet. "Reckon I need to talk to someone who knows more about these treaties. Henry White Elk scouts through here sometimes. Folks say he's a man who remembers the old agreements. He camps up near Thunder Basin most times," Hazel said. "But Kenneth, be careful. Blackwood's type don't take kindly to people asking questions about water rights." The next morning dawned clear and cool. Kenneth saddled his old mule, checking the cinch twice before securing his bedroll. Ashes paced anxiously, knowing they were heading out but limping too badly to make the journey. "You stay here and guard the wagon," Kenneth told the hound, scratching behind his ears. "Keep an eye on things for me." Hazel appeared from her cabin, carrying a bundle wrapped in clean cloth. "Here," she said, pressing it into his hands, "bread and dried apples." And Kenneth, she hesitated, then reached up to straighten his collar with gentle fingers. "Come back safe. I'll be praying for you." The touch of her hand lingered as Kenneth mounted up. He tucked the food into his saddlebag, nestled beside the precious packet of letters. The weight of them seemed heavier now, carrying not just paper and ink, but obligations that stretched back years. "I'll return soon as I can," he promised. Hazel nodded, one hand resting on Ash's head. "God go with you," she said softly. Kenneth turned his mule toward the mountains, their peaks sharp against the morning sky. Somewhere up there, Henry White Elk would help him understand what these letters truly meant, and what justice might require of a man who found truth hidden in a broken-down wagon. Kenneth urged his mule along the narrow mountain trails, each hoofbeat taking them higher into the rugged country east of Silver Bluff. The leather satchel holding the letters pressed against his side, a constant reminder of his purpose. Morning fog gave way to bright afternoon sun, then deep purple dusk as he made his solitary way through the wilderness. That first night, Kenneth built a small fire in a sheltered hollow. The flames cast dancing shadows as he spread the letters. On his bedroll, studying the careful handwriting by firelight, he pictured the family who had owned these papers, their hopes carried in a wagon now broken, their dreams perhaps buried with them somewhere on the hard trail west. The thought kept him awake long after the embers died. To Ashdot, the second day brought him deeper into the foothills. Scrub oak gave way to tall pines, their branches whispering in the high-altitude wind. His mule picked its way carefully across rocky slopes and through shallow creek beds. Kenneth kept his eyes sharp for signs of the Ute camp, noting broken branches and faint tracks that told of recent passage. Near sunset, smoke from cooking fires drew his attention to a protected valley. Several hide-covered lodges stood in a loose circle, with horses grazing in the meadow beyond. Kenneth approached slowly, hands visible, waiting at a respectful distance until he was noticed. 2 mounted warriors rode out to meet him. Kenneth kept his posture relaxed but alert as they circled his mule, examining him with careful eyes. "I seek Henry White Elk," Kenneth said clearly. "I bring papers he should see." The warriors exchanged glances, then one nodded toward the camp. They escorted Kenneth between the lodges, where women paused in their work to watch his passage. Children ducked behind their mothers' skirts, peeking out with curious eyes. Henry White Elk stood waiting, his tall frame straight as a pine tree. His dark eyes held wisdom earned through years of bridging to worlds. He wore buckskins and a cotton shirt with a silver band around his black hair shot through with gray. "Kenneth Boone," Henry said, his voice deep and measured, "you have ridden far to find me." "I have papers that speak of promises made," Kenneth replied. "I'd value your counsel on them." Henry gestured to a fire where meat was roasting on spits. "Share our meal first, then we will talk of such things." The venison was tender, seasoned with wild herbs. Kenneth ate carefully, knowing the honor of being invited to their fire. When the meal was done, Henry led him to sit slightly apart from the others. Kenneth brought out the letters, handling them gently. "These were hidden in a wagon I bought. They speak of agreements about water rights on Silver Creek." Henry took the packet, his weathered hands unfolding each page with care. His expression remained neutral as he read, but Kenneth noticed his fingers tighten on the edges of the paper. "I remember when these words were written," Henry said finally. "My father was there when the treaty was made. The army officer promised the water would be shared. Our people would have access to the creek for our horses. The settlers could water their crops." He looked up at Kenneth. Both sides understood this was sacred ground, that the water gave life to all. "The railroad aims to take that land now," Kenneth said quietly. "Their man, Blackwood, claims no treaties matter." Henry's face hardened. "They have already pushed us from other waters, fenced off springs that were promised to remain open. Bring their iron horse, caring nothing for what was agreed." He carefully refolded the letters. "These papers prove what we have said. But such men do not listen to paper or promises. What should be done? Kenneth asked. Henry studied him for a long moment. You are not a man seeking profit from these papers. I see in your eyes you want what is right. He nodded slowly. I will ride with you back to Silver Bluff. Perhaps together we can make them hear the truth of these promises. They talked long into the night, Henry sharing stories of the treaties, of how his people had tried to live in peace with the settlers, of broken promises and hard choices. Kenneth listened, understanding more with each tale how much rested on the yellowed pages in his Satchel. Dawn painted the sky in pale gold when Kenneth saddled his mule. Henry mounted his own horse, a strong bay that stood quietly under his touch. The camp stirred to life around them as women built up morning fires, and children carried water from the creek. The ride to Silver Bluff will take 2 days, Henry said, settling into his saddle. We should reach there before Blackwood can do more mischief. Kenneth nodded, feeling the weight of the letters against his ribs. His unlikely alliance with this dignified Ute Scout might be the only hope of protecting the water rights promised in those pages. As they rode out of the camp, the morning sun at their backs, Kenneth offered a silent prayer that truth and justice would prove stronger than greed. Kenneth and Henry rode into Silver Bluff as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty street. Their horses' hooves kicked up little clouds with each step, their weary bodies swaying in well-worn saddles after 2 days on the trail. The town seemed quieter than usual, with only a few folks lingering on the boardwalk outside the general store. Hazel McAllister stood near the partially repaired wagon behind the church. Her hands pressed to her apron when she spotted them approaching. Her face brightened with relief at Kenneth's return, then showed careful welcome as she noticed Henry riding beside him. "Welcome back," she called softly, stepping forward to meet them. Ashes lifted his head from where he'd been dozing in the shade, his tail starting a steady thump against the ground at Kenneth's return. Kenneth dismounted, his joints stiff from the long ride. "Hazel, this here is Henry White Elk. He studied the letters and confirms everything about the water rights." He turned to Henry, who had also dismounted with fluid grace. "Henry, this is Hazel McAllister." Henry removed his hat and bowed his head respectfully. "The blessing of the Creator be with you, Mrs. McAllister." "Please, call me Hazel," she replied warmly. "You both must be hungry after your journey. I've got stew simmering at home." Before Kenneth could respond, Reverend Carlin emerged from the church's back door, his weathered Bible tucked under one arm, his eyes crinkled with genuine pleasure at seeing their small gathering. "Henry White Elk," the preacher said, extending his hand. "It's been too long since you passed through our town." "Welcome, brother," Henry clasped the offered hand. "Reverend Carlin, your words of peace are remembered among my people." A few townsfolk had paused to stare at their group, whispering behind raised hands. Kenneth noticed Henry's quiet dignity. In the face of their suspicious glances, the preacher saw it too, and loudly announced, "Let's move this conversation to more comfortable the wagon's coming along nicely. Kenneth, shall we gather there?" Kenneth nodded, pride warming his chest as they turned toward his wagon. Over the past weeks, he'd replaced broken boards, patched the canvas, and fixed what wheels he could. Though still humble, it no longer looked like the wreck that had drawn mockery at the auction. Hazel hurried home to fetch her promised stew while the men tended to their horses. When she returned, carrying a heavy pot and a basket of cornbread, the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and purple behind the mountains. Kenneth lit a lantern and hung it from the wagon's center bow. The warm light glowed through the patched canvas, creating a cozy space that felt separate from the darkening world outside. They settled on boxes and blankets, making a circle in the wagon's bed. Ashes patted up the wooden steps Kenneth had built, and found a spot near Hazel's feet, his scarred face content as she slipped him bits of meat from her bowl. The dog's tail kept up a steady rhythm against the floorboards. "Let us give thanks," Reverend Carlin said softly, and they bowed their heads as he offered a simple prayer of gratitude for food, fellowship, and safe travels. The stew was rich with vegetables from Hazel's garden, the cornbread still warm. They passed the serving spoon and shared the simple meal, their conversation flowing naturally. Henry spoke of his people's traditions about the sacredness of water, while the preacher related stories of his circuit-riding days. Hazel's quiet laugh joined Kenneth's deeper one at the Reverend's tale of baptizing converts in a creek full of startled frogs. The lantern cast their shadows large against the canvas walls, and Kenneth found himself studying them, the preacher's gentle gestures as he spoke. Henry's dignified profile, Hazel's hands moving as she broke cornbread. Even Ash's shadow seemed to belong, his head resting contentedly on his paws. Something tight in Kenneth's chest began to loosen. The wagon, once a symbol of his foolishness and poverty, had become something else entirely. Here, within its humble walls, he'd found what he hadn't even known he was seeking. Not just shelter, but fellowship, family. He caught Hazel's eye across the lantern light and saw his own wonder reflected there. She smiled, a tender expression that warmed him more than any fire could. Reverend Carlin was describing his hopes for the church's future, his words weaving another thread into their growing bond. Henry added his own quiet wisdom, speaking of how his people viewed family as something broader than blood, a circle that could widen to embrace those chosen by the heart. The canvas walls glowed like honey in the lamplight, and the evening air carried the scent of sage from the hills. Kenneth sat in this moment of perfect contentment, hardly daring to breathe lest he break its spell. Here, in this once broken wagon, he had stumbled into something precious, a belonging he'd thought forever lost to him in those lonely years. In the mountains, Ash's tail kept its steady beat against the boards, a rhythm like a heart finding its way home. The peaceful evening dissolved into nightmare as midnight crept over Silver Bluff. Kenneth had dozed off near the wagon steps. Ashes curled at his feet when the first shadows slipped between the buildings. The dog's growl jerked him awake, just as something heavy thudded against the wagon's side. Rough laughter cut through the darkness. Time to learn your place, mountain man. Flames erupted along the canvas wall, spreading with terrifying speed. Kenneth leaped to his feet, heart pounding as orange light revealed 5 men in dark clothes, their faces hidden by bandanas. The fire crawled up the fabric like hungry fingers, consuming his home. No Kenneth charged forward, but a fist slammed into his jaw. He staggered, tasting blood. 2 men grabbed his arms, while a third drove knuckles into his ribs. Pain exploded through his chest. Hazel's scream pierced the night. She had been sleeping in her house nearby, and now came running, her nightdress billowing. "Help! Fire! Someone help!" Henry White Elk emerged from the shadows like a spirit, his rifle swinging in a deadly arc. The wooden stock caught one attacker in the shoulder, sending him sprawling. Cowards who strike in darkness. Henry's voice carried both fury and contempt. The wagon's canvas blazed bright as day now, casting wild shadows across the churning fight. Kenneth broke free and lunged for the water barrel, but a boot caught him behind the knees. He crashed to the ground as flames devoured everything he had built. Then came a sound that stopped his heart, a child's terrified cry from inside the burning wagon. "Tommy!" Hazel's voice cracked with horror. "Tommy Miller's in there. He sometimes sneaks into play." Ashes didn't hesitate. The dog shot past Kenneth and bounded up the flaming steps, disappearing into the inferno. Kenneth tried to follow, but caught another blow to the face that sent him reeling. Seconds stretched like hours. The wagon groaned as supports began to fail. Then Ashes burst through the flames, dragging 8-year-old Tommy Miller by his shirt collar. The boy's face was streaked with soot, but he was alive, coughing and crying. Hazel snatched Tommy away from the fire while Henry swung his rifle, again keeping the attackers back. But Ashes collapsed on the ground, his fur singed, one leg twisted wrongly beneath him. "You'll regret crossing the railroad," one of the men snarled. They retreated into the darkness as townspeople finally began arriving with buckets. It was too late for the wagon. The frame shuddered and gave way with a thunderous crash, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. Kenneth could only watch blood running down his face as his dream crumbled into glowing embers. "Tommy, my boy." Mrs. Miller pushed through the gathering crowd and clutched her son, sobbing. The child was frightened but unhurt, saved by a dog's courage. Dawn found Kenneth sitting in the dirt beside the blackened ruins. His body ached from the beating, and Hazel's gentle hands stung as she cleaned cuts on his face with a damp cloth. Henry knelt nearby, examining Ash's burns and injured leg. The dog whimpered but remained still, trusting his friend's touch. "The leg's not broken," Henry said softly, "but these burns will need tending." He began applying a poultice of herbs from his medicine bag. Kenneth stared at the wreckage. The hidden trunk with its precious letters had survived, protected by earth and stone, but everything else was gone. The walls that had held such joy just hours ago lay in ashes. The sanctuary he had created, the first real home he'd known in years, had been destroyed by men who valued profit over people. Hazel pressed a cool cloth against the swelling around his eye. "We'll rebuild," she whispered. But Kenneth barely heard her. Despair weighed on him like a mountain of stone. All his work, all his hopes, reduced to smoking ruins in a single, violent night. Ashes lifted his head and wind softly, trying to crawl closer despite his injuries. The dog's loyalty, unchanged by fire and pain, made Kenneth's throat tighten. He reached out to stroke the singed fur, remembering how Ashes had charged into flames without hesitation to save a child. The sun rose higher, morning light, revealing the full extent of destruction. Townspeople gathered at a distance, murmuring. Among themselves, Kenneth sat amidst the ashes of his dreams, his body battered, his faithful dog hurt, the wagon nothing but charred timber and melted canvas. The taste of defeat was bitter in his mouth. "Your wounds need proper tending," Hazel said, helping him stand. "Come to my house, both of you." Her voice was gentle but firm, brooking no argument. Henry carefully lifted Ashes, the dog trembling, but trusting. Together they walked away from the ruins, leaving black footprints in the dust. Behind them, thin wisps of smoke still rose from the wreckage, carrying away Kenneth's brief glimpse of happiness into the morning sky. 3 days passed like a fever dream. Kenneth drifted between sleep and waking in Hazel's small cabin, his body a map of bruises and bandaged cuts. Morning light filtered through cotton curtains, casting soft shadows on rough-hewn walls. The familiar scent of coffee and wood smoke mingled with herbs Henry had left for healing. Near the stone hearth, Ashes lay on a worn quilt, his burned fur wrapped in clean linen. The dog's chest rose and fell steadily, though each breath carried a slight whimper. His injured leg, carefully splinted, rested on a folded blanket. Despite his pain, Ash's tail would thump weakly whenever Kenneth spoke. Loyal to the end, Kenneth shifted on the narrow bed, wincing as pain shot through his ribs. Every breath reminded him of the beating, but worse was the weight crushing his spirit. He'd brought this violence down on those he cared about. The wagon's destruction played over and over in his mind. The flames, the child's cry, Ashes charging into the inferno, all because he'd been too stubborn to back down. "Stop blaming yourself." Hazel's voice was gentle but firm as she knelt beside him, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. "I can see guilt eating at you plain as day." "My fault," Kenneth whispered. "Horsley should have sold that wagon first day." Ashes, his voice broke. "Ashes," his voice broke. "That boy lived because of you and Ashes," Hazel countered. "Those railroad men, they're the ones who chose violence, not you." The cabin door creaked open, admitting Henry White Elk. The Ute Scout carried fresh herbs in a leather pouch, his face grave but determined. "The letters survived," he said, placing the medicine on Hazel's table. "They cannot burn truth so easily." Kenneth turned his face to the wall. "What good are letters now? Everything's gone." "Not everything." Henry's voice held the patience of mountains. "You still breathe. The dog still breathes. And justice does not die with one wagon." Afternoon shadows lengthened across the floor when Reverend Carlin arrived, his Bible tucked under one arm. The preacher settled into Hazel's rocking chair, studying Kenneth with kind eyes. "Wondering where God is in all this?" the Reverend asked. Softly, Kenneth's throat tightened. "Feels like he's turned away." Or perhaps, Reverend Carlin suggested, "He's testing not your strength, but your faith." Remember Job. He lost everything, yet God never abandoned him. "I ain't Job," Kenneth muttered. "Just a fool who thought he could stand against men with money and power." "You stood for what's right," the preacher corrected. "That's never foolish in God's eyes." As night drew its curtain across the windows, Kenneth lay awake, listening to crickets chirp and Ashes breathe. Tears he'd held back for days finally broke free, rolling silently down his cheeks. "Lord," he whispered into the darkness, "I ain't strong enough for this fight. Please, please help me find the way." The floorboards creaked softly as Hazel moved through the shadows. She sat on the edge of his bed and took his calloused hand in hers. Her touch was warm, steady, like an anchor in a storm. They burned wood and canvas, she said quietly, but they can't burn what matters most. They can't burn faith, Kenneth. They can't burn love, or justice, or truth. Her fingers tightened. Around his, they can't burn hope. Ashes wind softly from his bed by the hearth, as if agreeing. Kenneth squeezed Hazel's hand, clinging to her words like a lifeline. In the gentle darkness of her cabin, surrounded by friends who refused to let him fall, he felt something stir in his chest, not quite hope yet, but perhaps its first faint spark. "You're not alone," Hazel whispered, her thumb tracing circles. On his palm, "Whatever comes next, you face it with us beside you." Kenneth closed his eyes, letting her words sink deep into his wounded soul. The pain still throbbed, the loss still ached, but here in this moment, he felt God's presence return, not in thunder or lightning, but in the quiet strength of joined hands and faithful hearts. After a week of rest in Hazel's cabin, Kenneth's body began to heal, though deep bruises still painted his ribs in purple and yellow. The morning sun streamed through the window as he gripped the edge of the bed, pushing himself to stand. His legs trembled, but determination burned brighter than pain. "Easy now," Hazel cautioned, hovering nearby with a sturdy wooden cane. "No need to rush." Kenneth accepted the cane, fingers wrapping around its smooth handle. Each breath hurt, but the anger in his heart hurt worse. "Can't lie here forever. Those railroad men think they broke us. Time to show them different." Word of the wagon burning had spread through Silver Bluff like wildfire. Throughout the morning, townspeople stopped by Hazel's cabin, bringing food and fierce promises of support. Sarah Jensen, whose boy Tommy had been saved from the flames, brought fresh bread and tearful thanks. Old Pete Murphy, who'd once laughed at Kenneth's wagon purchase, now offered his wagon team for transport. Henry White Elk arrived just before noon, his face set with purpose. "I have spoken with the elder families," he said, settling into a chair. While Ashes limped over to greet him, many remember the treaty. They will speak of promises made, of shared waters that sustained both peoples. Kenneth nodded, grateful for the Ute Scout's dedication. "Reckon that'll carry weight?" "Truth carries its own weight," Henry replied, pulling out a leather folder. "I have gathered their stories here, written in both English and Ute, the judge. Must hear all voices." Reverend Carlin appeared shortly after, his Bible tucked under one arm and legal papers under the other. The preacher had spent days preparing their case, his usual gentle manner hardened by righteous purpose. "The law may bend to railroad gold," the Reverend said, spreading documents on Hazel's table, "but it cannot ignore treaty rights entirely. We'll present the letters, the testimonies, and God willing, justice will prevail." Kenneth studied the papers, then looked at the faces around him. Hazel's quiet strength, Henry's dignified resolve, the Reverend's faithful determination. Something swelled in his chest, pushing back against despair. "Best we do this proper," he said, reaching for his coat. "Take these letters to the courthouse today." Hazel immediately moved to his side, her arms steady as he wavered. "I'll walk with you," she said, brooking no argument. Henry gathered the documents while the Reverend led the way outside. The walk to the courthouse felt longer than ever before. Kenneth leaned heavily on the cane, each step sending sparks of pain through his ribs. But Hazel matched his slow pace, her presence a constant comfort. Townsfolk paused their work to watch, many nodding in support or touching their hats in respect. Inside the courthouse, the air hung heavy with tension. Blackwood lounged against the far wall, his expensive suit a stark contrast to Kenneth's patched clothing. The railroad agent's smirk faltered slightly at seeing the size of their group, still pushing this foolishness. "Boone," Blackwood drawled, "railroad gold speaks louder than mountain man's pride." "Truth speaks loudest," Kenneth replied, his voice steady despite his weakness. "And we aim to speak plenty." The judge, a weathered man named Harrison, studied the gathering with sharp eyes. Reverend Carlin stepped forward, presenting their request for a hearing with careful formality. The letters, safely preserved despite the wagon's destruction, passed from hand to hand. Judge Harrison adjusted his spectacles, reading slowly. The courthouse fell silent, save for the ticking of the wall clock. Finally, he looked up. "Serious accusations require proper hearing," he declared. "I'll set the case for next week, Tuesday morning. Both sides will present their evidence." His gaze settled on Blackwood. All sides will abide by the law's process. The railroad agent's face darkened, but he offered a stiff nod. As they filed out of the courthouse, Kenneth felt the weight of what lay ahead. 1 week to prepare their case against the railroads, army of lawyers and bottomless coffers. On the courthouse steps, their small group paused. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street, and a cool breeze carried the scent of sage from the distant hills. Henry placed a hand on Kenneth's shoulder, speaking softly in Ute before translating. "My people say the truth is like water. It finds its way through any barrier." "Amen to that," Reverend Carlin agreed, clutching his Bible close. Hazel's hand found Kenneth's, her fingers intertwining with his. Together, they bowed their heads as the Reverend offered a prayer, asking for strength and wisdom in the days ahead. The words floated up into the clear mountain air, carrying their hopes with them. Kenneth looked at these people who had become his family, Hazel with her unwavering support, Henry with his quiet wisdom, the Reverend with his fierce faith. The road ahead would be hard, but he was no longer walking it alone. The week before the hearing stretched long and tense in Silver Bluff. Railroad men in dark coats lounged against storefronts, their eyes following Kenneth's slow progress between Hazel's cabin and the church. But for every railroad thug, 2 townspeople appeared nearby. Shotguns casual but ready across their arms. Old Pete Murphy took first watch outside Hazel's cabin, his wagon positioned to block any midnight visitors. Sarah Jensen's husband, Tom, patrolled the churchyard where Kenneth spent his days preparing, while their son Tommy brought soup and biscuits wrapped in clean cloth. Inside Hazel's warm kitchen, Ashes lay curled by the stove, his burned flank wrapped in fresh bandages. Hazel changed them twice daily, speaking soft words as she worked. "You're healing fine, brave boy," she murmured, gentle fingers applying healing salve. "Just like your master, stronger than them railroad men knew." The dog's tail thumped weakly against the floorboards, his eyes following Kenneth as he paced the small room, letters in hand. Hour after hour, Kenneth practiced reading the cramped handwriting aloud, determined to present every word clearly before the judge. And furthermore, the rights to water access shall be maintained for both settler and Ute alike. As witnessed this 15th day of May, 1862, Kenneth's voice grew stronger with each reading, though his ribs still ached. Hazel paused in her work, listening. "You're sounding more sure each time," she encouraged. "The judge will hear the truth in those words." Henry White Elk visited daily, bringing news from the Ute family's gathering to support their cause. He sat at Hazel's table, his dignified bearing unchanged by the railroad men's sneers, carefully organizing his testimony. "My father stood beside the army captain that day," Henry explained, spreading his own papers beside Kenneth's letters. "I was young, but I remember. The peace pipe was shared, promises made beneath the sacred mountains. These things cannot be forgotten." Reverend Carlin brought legal documents borrowed from Denver, his fingers ink-stained from taking notes. "The treaty's registration is clear," he said. "The railroad can't simply ignore prior agreements, no matter how much gold lines their pockets." The night before the hearing, they gathered in Hazel's cabin. The lamp burned low as darkness settled over the hills. Outside, faithful neighbors kept watch, but inside, the small group knelt together in prayer. Kenneth's voice wavered as he spoke. "Lord, I ain't much for fancy words, but I'm scared of failing these good people. That wagon you led me to, it held more than just papers. It held hope for justice. I don't want to let that hope die." Hazel's hand found his, warm and steady. "Kenneth Boone, listen close," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Sometimes God asks us to stand for what's right, knowing we might fall. The standing itself matters. Win or lose tomorrow, you've already shown this town what courage looks." "Like she speaks wisdom," Henry added softly. "My people say honor lives in the heart that fights for justice, not just in victory." Reverend Carlin raised his Bible. "Remember David before Goliath? He said, 'The boy had only stones against a giant, but God stood with him.' We go tomorrow with truth as our weapon." They bowed their heads as the preacher prayed, asking for strength and clarity. Kenneth felt Hazel's fingers tighten around his, heard Henry's quiet amen join with theirs. Ashes lifted his head from his blanket by the stove, adding a soft whine of solidarity. When the prayer ended, they sat in peaceful silence. The lamp flickered, casting their shadows large against Hazel's walls. Kenneth looked at each face, the preacher's determined faith, Henry's dignified certainty, Hazel's unwavering support. Something settled in his chest, replacing fear with resolve. "Much obliged," he said roughly, "for standing with me through this." "We stand together," Hazel corrected, rising to pour coffee. "That's what family does." They shared the hot coffee and what remained of Hazel's bread, speaking quietly of practical things. What time to arrive at the courthouse? Which documents to present first? How to help Kenneth stand steady during his testimony? The ordinary tasks of preparation somehow made the extraordinary challenge ahead feel manageable. As the evening deepened, Kenneth felt a strange peace descend. Whatever tomorrow brought, he was no longer the lonely mountain man with a worthless wagon. He had found something more precious than any deed he had found belonging. "We should rest," Reverend Carlin finally said, gathering his papers. "Tomorrow comes early." Henry nodded, touching his heart in farewell. "I will bring my people's voices," he promised. "The judge will hear all our stories." One by one they rose, ready to face whatever the dawn would bring. Kenneth knew there would be little sleep this night. But as he looked at these people who had become his family, he felt stronger than any railroad gold could buy. The Silver Bluff courthouse creaked. Under the weight of so many bodies, townsfolk packed the wooden benches, their Sunday best dusty from the morning's walk. Farmers stood along the walls, hat brims twisted in weathered hands. Even the Ute families filed in quietly, dignified in their presence despite the stares. Blackwood strutted before the judge's bench, his suit immaculate, his smile sharp as a knife. Railroad maps unfurled across the table with dramatic flair, their crisp lines and official stamps demanding attention. "Your Honor," Blackwood's voice dripped confidence, "these maps show the authorized railway expansion. Properly filed, properly purchased." He lifted a stack of documents. Every acre accounted for, every claim verified by territorial authorities. He cast a dismissive glance at Kenneth. Unlike certain questionable papers found in abandoned refuse, Kenneth sat between Hazel and Henry, his bruises still visible, his hands trembling slightly on the letters in his lap. When the judge called his name, he rose slowly, leaning on his cane. The room hushed as Kenneth limped forward. Ashes, still bandaged but loyal, followed at his heels. Kenneth's voice started soft but grew stronger with each word as he read the letters aloud. "These promises were made in good faith," he said, holding up the aged papers, "between settlers who worked this land and army officers who gave their word. The water rights were meant for all, both homesteader and Ute alike. Henry White Elk stood next, his bearing proud. "I witnessed the treaty signing as a boy," he testified. "My father and the army captain shared the peace pipe beneath Thunder Mountain. Such ceremonies are sacred. The promises cannot be broken." Without great dishonor, Reverend Carlin approached the bench, Bible in hand. "Your Honor, there's more at stake than mere property lines. This is about the moral weight of promises made. When we disregard such agreements, we tear the very fabric that binds communities together." Murmurs rippled through the courthouse. Kenneth watched faces change as the truth of the letters sank in. Even some of Blackwood's men shifted uncomfortably. Unable to meet the steady gaze of the Ute elders, the judge studied the documents carefully, his expression thoughtful. "These claims require verification," he announced finally. "I'll delay my ruling until all evidence can be properly examined. But let it be noted, prior agreements, if proven valid, must be honored, even by the railroad." Blackwood's face darkened, but the spark of victory had already been struck. Outside the courthouse, beneath the bright Colorado sky, Kenneth turned to Hazel. "I couldn't have done this alone," he whispered, clasping her hand. "Your faith in me, it gave me strength when I had none left." Hazel's fingers tightened around his, her smile warm as sunshine. "Faith in what's right is never wasted," she said softly. "No matter what comes next." Autumn frost painted the mornings silver as weeks crept past. Kenneth's bruises faded to yellow, then vanished altogether, though his ribs still ached when the weather turned. He spent his days at Hazel's cabin mending her split-rail fences, one post at a time, working slowly but steady as his strength returned. Ashes kept close watch from the porch. his burned fur growing back patchy, but his spirit undiminished. The loyal hound still favored his right side. But his tail wagged fierce whenever Hazel brought out breakfast biscuits or Kenneth returned from checking fence lines. "You're both healing well," Hazel would say, her hand gentle on Kenneth's shoulder as she passed him coffee in the cool dawn light. The quiet moments between them grew comfortable, filled with shared glances and soft words about simple things: the weather, the garden, tomorrow's work. Henry White Elk visited often, sharing news from town while helping Kenneth splice fence. Rails they worked in easy silence, broken by quiet discussions of justice and what it meant to stand together. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for word from the judge. The evening the rider came. Kenneth was stacking firewood while Hazel picked the last of her garden's turnips. The horses' hooves thundered down the rutted road, kicking up dust in the fading light. The messenger, one of the judge's clerks, clutched a sealed envelope. Hands trembling, Kenneth broke the seal and read the words aloud. His voice grew stronger with each line. The deed was valid, the treaty rights upheld. The railroad could not seize the land. Justice, so long denied, had finally prevailed. Hazel's turnips tumbled forgotten in the dirt as she rushed to embrace him. Her tears fell warm against his shirt, and Kenneth held her close, his own eyes burning. Ashes barked joyfully, limping circles around their feet. Word spread like wildfire. Townsfolk poured from their homes, gathering in the twilight. Henry arrived at full gallop, his usually stern face bright with triumph. He clasped Kenneth's arm in the traditional way of his people. "You have honored both the settlers' hope and my people's dignity," Henry said, his voice rich with emotion. "This victory belongs to all who believe in truth." Reverend Carlin led an impromptu prayer of thanksgiving, while children danced and women brought out pies meant for tomorrow. In the gathering darkness, lanterns bobbed like earthbound stars as neighbors celebrated together. Kenneth stood in the midst of it all, Hazel's hand warm in his, watching settler and Ute alike share in the joy of justice served. His heart swelled with wonder. The broken wagon that had once drawn mockery had led him here to healing. His scattered life, like the wagon itself, had become a gathering point for something far stronger than himself, a community bound by honor and faith. The autumn sun painted Silver Bluff golden as townsfolk gathered around the new wagon. Its fresh, blue paint gleaming like a jewel against the dusty street. Kenneth stood in awe, barely recognizing it as the same broken-down shell he had purchased months ago. Now it stood proud and tall, a testament to the community's shared labor and love. Hazel fussed with the cream-colored curtains she had sewn herself, adjusting them just so in the polished windows. Her nimble fingers had stitched not just fabric, but hope into every careful hem. The wooden steps, freshly carved by the carpenter, led up to a door that hung straight and true. Ashes. His coat, mostly regrown, though still bearing the scars of his bravery, chased laughing children around the wagon's wheels. His limp had eased to barely a whisper, and his joyful barks echoed across the yard. The children squealed with delight as he herded them in circles, his tail wagging with pure happiness. Reverend Carlin raised his weathered Bible, offering a blessing that brought tears to more than a few eyes. "Lord, make this wagon a sanctuary of your peace," he intoned, his voice carrying clear in the crisp air. Henry White Elk sat beside Kenneth, both men's faces glowing with quiet pride as evening painted the sky purple. Lantern lights spilled warm and golden from the wagon's windows. Inside, Kenneth, Hazel, Henry, and the preacher gathered around a small table, sharing fresh bread and steaming stew. The wagon smelled of pine wood and possibility. "Who would have thought," Kenneth mused, looking around at the faces of his chosen family, "that $1 silver could buy such richness?" His hand found Hazel's, and she squeezed it gently, her smile soft in the lamplight. Outside, townspeople pointed at the warm glow within, their whispers now filled with admiration rather than scorn. The wagon stood as a beacon of what faith and courage could build from broken things. If you believe stories can heal, lift, and connect us, this channel is for you. Thanks for being here. Hit subscribe, and I'll meet you again tomorrow with something real.